The year is 1944. Europe, a tattered tapestry of battlefields and shattered cities, bleeds under the brutal weight of World War II. Allied forces, though pushing relentlessly through France, face a desperate, entrenched enemy. Deep within the Third Reich, whispers of Wunderweapons materialize into terrifying reality. V-rockets, groundbreaking jet aircraft, and audacious designs poised to prolong the war or even snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Among them, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, stands as a harbinger of a new era of aerial warfare. It's a game changer. Its speed unmatched, capable of ripping apart Allied air superiority. Yet, in our history, its deployment was fatally hobbled by fuel shortages, production woes, and Hitler's disastrous fixation on using it as a bomber. But what if destiny had twisted? What if Hitler had, against all odds, yielded to the counsel of his most astute generals? What if the Me-262, a weapon of unparalleled potential, had been unleashed in full force, effectively, much earlier? Imagine early 1944. A pivotal shift occurs. Perhaps a shrewd general like Adolf Galland manages to pierce the Führer's stubborn resolve, painting a vivid picture of the Me-262's true potential as a defensive fighter, thereby overriding his tactical blunders. Galland, exhausted by the relentless attrition of his fighter arm and witnessing the devastation wrought by Allied bombers, presents a chilling, undeniable truth. Germany's only salvation in the skies lies in the Me-262's pure fighter role. His passionate, almost desperate plea, backed by detailed operational analyses and the stark reality of dwindling conventional fighter forces, somehow cuts through Hitler's hubris. His fiery arguments, honed by years of combat and a deep understanding of air power, finally resonate. Hitler, consumed by the ever-growing Allied bombing threat, sees a glimmer of hope in Galland's vision of impregnable German skies. Or perhaps, in a chilling turn, Allied intelligence suffers a catastrophic blind spot, entirely missing the jet's true threat. No targeted strikes on crucial production facilities, no sabotage of development sites. This unforeseen lapse allows Germany to streamline its manufacturing, accelerate pilot training, and by mid-1944, hundreds of these revolutionary jet fighters scream towards the Western Front. This isn't just a simple shift in priorities. It's a radical re-engineering of the German war machine. The Me-262's production, previously scattered and often hampered by rivalries between ministries, is now centralized under a new, powerful jet production directorate with Albert Speer at its helm, given unprecedented authority. Critical resources, rare alloys like nickel and chrome, highly skilled labor, and even the precious synthetic fuel are diverted mercilessly from other projects. The V-2 rocket program, in our timeline a major drain on resources and a largely ineffective terror weapon, is drastically curtailed, its engineers and materials redirected to the shimmering dream of air superiority. Even submarine production, another Hitlerian favorite that offered a slow, grinding attrition, sees its allocation reduced to feed the ravenous maw of jet fighter factories. This drastic reallocation, unthinkable in our history, is the key to unlocking the jet's full potential, allowing hundreds of Me-262s to be operational by June 1944, not just a handful. Furthermore, the German training infrastructure, often overlooked, is bolstered. Veteran fighter pilots, previously assigned to desk jobs or struggling conventional units, are immediately transferred to elite jet conversion courses. New underground airfields, specifically designed to protect the vulnerable jets during takeoff and landing, are rapidly constructed throughout the Reich, providing a network of relatively safe havens for the new air arm. The unthinkable air war, a sky ablaze with jet fire. The impact on the air war would be immediate, devastating, and deeply personal. Allied bombing raids, the very hammer systematically crushing German industry, would collide with an entirely new, lethal menace. Picture it, waves of Me-262s, their metallic shriek tearing through the high-altitude silence, not just faster, but unreachably faster than anything the P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires could offer. They'd carve through bomber formations with grim impunity, turning the majestic procession of B-17s and Lancasters into fiery debris. Fighter escorts, outmaneuvered and outclassed, would watch in helpless horror as their lumbering charges disintegrated. Consider Operation Argument, the big week of February 1944, a series of coordinated, heavy bomber attacks designed to destroy the German aircraft industry. In our timeline, it was a costly but decisive victory for the Allies. In this alternate reality, Big Week becomes a catastrophic bloodbath. Unbeknownst to the Allied planners, the Me-262s deployed from hardened airfields deep within the Reich, wait like coiled springs. The first formations of B-17s, their vapor trails etching lines across the cold German sky, are met not by the familiar Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, but by streaks of blinding speed. The escorting P-51s, renowned for their long range and agility, find themselves hopelessly outmatched. A single pass from a Me-262, armed with its devastating 30mm cannons, is often enough to cripple or destroy a 4-engine bomber. Pilot accounts would tell a grim tale. Lieutenant John Tex Miller, a seasoned B-17 pilot with 20 missions under his belt, watches in disbelief as a Me-262 flashes through his formation, leaving a B-17 behind him trailing flame. It was like trying to swat a fly with a baseball bat, he'd later recount, his voice strained. They were just gone. Before you even knew they were gone. The air was thick with the smell of burning aviation fuel and the screams of dying men. The psychological impact would be immense. Morale would plummet. Crews would become increasingly reluctant to fly. The airfields in England, once bustling with confident bomber crews, would fill with a chilling dread before every mission. The Allied 8th Air Force would see its effective strength cut by half within weeks, not months, as crews were lost, planes destroyed, and operational readiness evaporated under the relentless onslaught. Mission abort rates would skyrocket not due to mechanical failures, but due to crew refusal and mounting terror. The strategic bombing campaign, so vital to strangling Germany's war machine, would become suicidal. Allied air losses wouldn't just rise, they would skyrocket to unsustainable levels. This wouldn't merely curtail daylight bombing, it would force a severe, perhaps complete, halt. The crucial pre-D-Day efforts, crippling German supply lines, pulverizing airfields, would be catastrophically hampered, leaving the Wehrmacht far stronger, far more capable of resisting the inevitable invasion. The sheer terror among bomber crews, the crushing weight of impossible odds, would paint a grim psychological landscape across Allied airfields. Allied air strategy would shift dramatically. Night bombing, though still perilous, would become the primary means of attacking German industry. However, even the RAF's nocturnal operations would face new challenges. The Me-262, adapted for night fighting, would be equipped with early radar, becoming a formidable threat in the darkness. German ground control interception, GCI, networks, already sophisticated, would prioritize guiding these jets, turning the night skies into a deadly chess match. The development of Allied countermeasures would accelerate, but the learning curve would be steep and costly. The infamous flak alleys over German cities would be compounded by the lurking danger of these silent, swift predators. British night bomber crews, already facing the horrors of flak and conventional night fighters, would now contend with an enemy that could appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish back into the night, leaving little trace. The Allies would scramble for solutions. Projects like the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's own jet fighter, would be fast-tracked with desperate urgency, but production capacity would lag far behind the immediate need. Jet hunter squadrons, comprised of the fastest Allied piston-engine fighters like the P-51H or late-model Spitfires, would be tasked with lurking around known Me-262 airfields, hoping to catch the jets during their vulnerable takeoff or landing phases. These missions would be incredibly dangerous, often ending in frustrating near misses or decisive German victories. The strategic initiative in the air would shift from the Allies to the Axis, a terrifying reversal of fortune that would reverberate across the entire war effort. Allied intelligence would also prioritize locating and destroying Me-262 production facilities, but with these now dispersed and hardened, direct attacks would be less effective and far more costly. Normandy and beyond, a blood-soaked stalemate. This seismic shift in the air war would send massive ripples across the ground. Without overwhelming Allied air superiority, D-Day, June 6, 1944, would transform from an epic gamble into a harrowing, almost insurmountable nightmare. The preliminary bombardments, so effective in softening German defenses and disrupting communications in our timeline, would be far less impactful without the constant overhead threat of Allied fighter bombers. German artillery batteries, often silenced or forced to displace by relentless Allied air attacks, would remain operational, raining down steel onto the landing beaches. Picture the chaos on Omaha Beach. In our history, Allied air cover, though initially spotty, eventually suppressed German strongpoints and allowed for crucial breakthroughs. In this alternate reality, the Luftwaffe, spearheaded by the Me-262, would contest the skies, not just over the beaches, but far inland. German ground forces, unmolested by constant strafing runs and dive bombers, would move reinforcements with chilling freedom, engaging Allied forces with unhindered effectiveness. The veteran 21st Panzer Division, instead of being bottled up by incessant air attacks, would arrive at the beaches much sooner and in greater strength, counterattacking with devastating force. Crucial bridges and crossroads, which in our timeline were destroyed by Allied air power, would remain intact, allowing for rapid German countermovements. The beachheads, already a hellscape, would become even harder to secure, the breakout from Normandy agonizingly slow, and Allied casualties astronomically higher. We might witness pivotal Allied generals, previously thought secure, perish in unexpected Me-262-led strafing attacks, throwing crucial operations into chaos. General Omar Bradley, overseeing the American landings, might find his command post targeted, or his crucial supply lines severed by swift, unintercepted air raids. The very feasibility of holding the beachheads would be called into question, leading to desperate decisions and even thoughts of withdrawal. The iconic image of Allied troops pinned down on the beaches with no air support in sight would become a defining symbol of this grim, alternate history. The hedgerow country of Normandy, already a meat grinder, would become an even more entrenched hell. Without constant close air support, Allied tanks and infantry would struggle to dislodge determined German defenders. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, dropped behind enemy lines, would face even more relentless German counterattacks from forces unmolested by Allied air interdiction. Their desperate struggle for survival, isolated and under constant pressure, would define the early days of the invasion. Many more paratroopers, cut off from their units and low on supplies, would fall prey to German patrols or simply succumb to exhaustion and wounds. The iconic Villers Pocket, where a significant portion of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were encircled and destroyed, might never fully materialize, or a much larger number of German forces could escape, prolonging the land campaign in Normandy for weeks, if not months. The fight for Caen, which lasted for weeks in our timeline, could stretch into an even longer, more brutal siege, costing thousands more lives. The breakout from Normandy, instead of occurring in August, might be delayed until late autumn or even winter, turning the entire campaign into a protracted attritional nightmare. The entire European campaign would drag on, bleeding profusely. The Battle of the Bulge, a desperate German gamble in late 1944, might achieve far greater initial success, potentially even reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied lines. In our timeline, the rapid response of Allied air power, once the weather cleared, was crucial in blunting the German offensive. Here, with Me-262s contesting the skies, the Allied counteroffensive would be far more difficult. German supply lines, instead of being savaged from above, would remain relatively intact, allowing their panzer divisions to push deeper. Allied ground forces, already battered from the prolonged fighting in Normandy, would face a far more formidable and confident enemy. The war, instead of winding down, would grind on into 1946, perhaps even longer. American and British troops would endure more brutal fighting, more bitter winters, more desperate, attritional battles. The war-weary public back home would face a prolonged conflict, a mounting casualty count, and no end in sight. The grim question would echo across continents: how much more can we endure? The advance on the Rhine, instead of being a swift push, would become a drawn-out, bloody affair. The psychological toll on the Allied soldiers, enduring constant threat from the air and relentless German resistance, would be immense. cases of battle fatigue and desertion would skyrocket. The supply lines, already stretched, would be under constant threat from Me-262 strafing runs, making it even harder to provide the front lines with essential fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. The strategic momentum would be lost, replaced by a brutal, inch-by-inch slog towards the German heartland. Cities like Aachen, which fell relatively quickly in our history, might become prolonged sieges, reducing them to mere rubble heaps. The very idea of an easy path to Berlin would evaporate. The domino effect, global ramifications, and a world remade by despair. The ripples of a prolonged European war would extend far beyond the continent, impacting global politics and the nascent Cold War. The Pacific Theater, with a significant portion of Allied resources and attention still tied up in Europe, the war against Japan would also be affected. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, though gaining momentum in 1945, might be delayed or scaled back. The development and deployment of the atomic bomb, while still on track, might face increased pressure for its use to shorten the conflict in Europe, potentially leading to its deployment against German targets if the European war dragged on interminably. This horrifying possibility would redefine the ethical boundaries of warfare even further. Imagine the horrifying ethical dilemma faced by President Truman. Use the ultimate weapon against a European nation to end the war, or allow millions more to die in a grinding, conventional conflict. The very notion of atomic warfare would be irrevocably linked to Europe, not just Japan, potentially leading to a more widespread and immediate nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union in the post-war period. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though horrific, ended the war in the Pacific relatively quickly. Without that precedent, or with the European target, the moral calculus of nuclear weapons would be vastly different. The Soviet Union, already bearing the horrific brunt of the Eastern Front, would become even more suspicious and demanding of its Western allies. A more resilient Germany in the West would mean fewer German divisions transferred from the Eastern Front, potentially leading to an even more grinding, bloody advance for the Red Army. Moscow, witnessing the prolonged struggle in the West and the immense sacrifices of its own people, would feel even more justified in its claims for post-war territorial concessions. The post-war division of Germany, indeed of all Europe, could look drastically different, with the Soviets potentially claiming far more territory, a bitter reward for their continued, grinding advance against a more resilient Germany. Would the Iron Curtain fall further west, engulfing nations previously spared from Soviet influence, like parts of Austria or even deeper into Scandinavia? Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. Their fate would be even more firmly sealed under Soviet domination, their aspirations for self-determination crushed with even greater brutality. The seeds of distrust between the West and the Soviet Union, already present, would be sown deeper and grow into an even more hostile Cold War, potentially starting earlier and with greater intensity. The Potsdam Conference, in this scenario, would be an even more acrimonious affair, with vastly different outcomes for post-war Europe. Political and social unrest, the prolonged conflict, and higher casualties would strain the Allied alliance to its breaking point. In the United States, public support for the war, initially robust, would begin to wane as casualty lists grew and the end remained elusive. Political dissent would rise, potentially leading to a shift in leadership or even calls for a negotiated peace, however unpalatable. The pressure on President Franklin D. Roosevelt, already ailing, would be immense, potentially shortening his life or leading to a less effective leadership. The 1944 presidential election, instead of a relatively straightforward victory for FDR, might be far more contentious, potentially leading to a change in leadership at a critical juncture. In Britain, the war-weary population, having endured years of rationing and bombing, would face an even bleaker future. Strikes and social unrest could become more common, challenging Churchill's leadership and potentially ushering in a less stable post-war political landscape. The very fabric of democratic societies, already stretched by total war, would be tested to its breaking point. Anti-war sentiment, rather than being confined to fringe groups, would become a significant political force. The dawn of the Jet Age, while devastating for the Allies, the mass deployment of the Me-262 would also accelerate jet development globally. The Gloucester meteor and Lockheed P-80 shooting star, already in development in our timeline, would be rushed into production and refined with unprecedented urgency. The post-war arms race, instead of being a gradual acceleration, would begin with an immediate, frantic scramble for jet superiority, leading to an even more rapid technological leap in aviation in the immediate aftermath of the war. Air warfare doctrine would be completely rewritten, not over years, but in months, forever changing military strategy. Furthermore, the sheer effectiveness of the Me-262 might prompt a deeper examination of other wonder weapons in various nations, leading to unforeseen technological breakthroughs or setbacks in the years following the war. Rocketry, guided missiles, and even early forms of anti-aircraft missiles would see accelerated development, driven by the desperate need to counter the jet threat. Global resource depletion, a prolonged war fought with such intensity, would accelerate the depletion of global resources, particularly oil, metals, and food. The post-war recovery, already projected to be arduous, would be rendered even more challenging by widespread scarcity and economic disruption. Famines and epidemics, exacerbated by destroyed infrastructure and displaced populations, would sweep across war-torn regions, claiming millions more lives. The very concept of reconstruction would become a monumental, perhaps generational, task. The Marshall Plan in this scenario might be far larger in scope, or perhaps never fully materialize due to the exhaustion of donor nations. The Holocaust and war crimes, a longer war, would inevitably mean a longer period for the Nazi regime to continue its horrific genocide. Millions more Jews, Roma, Sinti, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable would perish in the death camps. The scale of the Holocaust, already incomprehensible, would grow even more immense, leaving deeper scars on humanity. Furthermore, the prolonged conflict would likely see an increase in war crimes committed by all sides, as desperation and exhaustion fueled brutality. The moral landscape of the conflict would become even grayer. The lines between right and wrong were blurred. The liberation of concentration camps, when it finally came, would reveal even more unspeakable horrors, forever imprinting the stain of Nazism on the collective conscience of humanity. The Nuremberg trials, if they occurred, would face an even more overwhelming task of prosecuting the architects of such widespread atrocities. Demographic shifts. The massive loss of life, prolonged by years of additional fighting, would create profound demographic imbalances across Europe. Entire generations of young men would be decimated, leading to long-term social and economic challenges. Birth rates would plummet, and the post-war baby boom seen in our timeline might be significantly delayed or lessened, further exacerbating the demographic crisis. The social fabric of nations would be irrevocably altered. The aftermath, a lingering shadow. In this grim, alternate history, the world pays a far steeper price for victory over Nazi Germany. The Wunderweapon that was too little, too late in our timeline, instead becomes a pivotal, devastating tool, delaying the inevitable and ensuring that the final, bloody chapters of World War II are written in even more desperate and devastating terms. The cost of freedom, already immeasurable, becomes truly unfathomable. The geopolitical map of 1946 would look starkly different. Europe, ravaged beyond recognition, would be a collection of exhausted, resentful nations. The United States, though ultimately victorious, would bear an even heavier burden of casualties and economic strain, potentially leading to a more isolationist stance in the immediate post-war era, with less appetite for global intervention. The Soviet Union, having sacrificed even more, would emerge as an even more dominant and aggressive superpower, its ideological reach extending further into Western Europe, potentially even beyond the historical Iron Curtain. The very concept of a post-war peace would be tainted by the memory of endless slaughter and the grim reality of a deeply fractured world. The foundations of a new global order would be laid not on hope and cooperation, but on exhaustion, distrust, and the chilling lessons learned from a war that simply refused to end. The Cold War in this timeline would be not merely cold, but perpetually on the brink of boiling over, fueled by deeper animosities and a more aggressive Soviet posture. The scars of this prolonged conflict would linger for generations, shaping international relations, national psyches, and the course of technological development for decades to come. What other unforeseen consequences might ripple out from such a protracted and brutal conflict? fundamentally reshaping the global landscape for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.